morning, good afternoon. How are you doing out there in the world? And well, this is a revamp of Prepare, Respond, Recover, a program we put on I guess 2 years ago, right? We started with it, really looking into all different aspects of what it is to respond to large scale emergencies, and not just emergency management, but we're looking at law, fire, EMS, private industry, public side of things. It's a broad brush. And so I'm excited. And so Todd and Todd Mans, that is, the two Todds here, started talking about it, what it is, and he's got some really great insight. I've known Todd for a while now. And as you can tell here, the Blue Cell is the premier sponsor of this program. And so I want to thank Todd for that. And Todd, welcome to our show, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Hey, well, thanks for the welcome. And it was kind of funny as we were kind of batting this around at the end of last year, and here we are now getting ready to kind of jump right into it. But certainly, the world's events have helped us to have at least some stuff to talk about in the last 30 days. It feels like it's April already, and I know we'll get into a little bit of that. But thanks for having me. I'm glad to be part of it.
I think this is the longest January I've ever lived.
Right. Well, it's, in some ways, we're thinking back a little bit to, what's gone on. I was in New Orleans this week, and the events of New Year's Eve are in the distant past. And they're worried about a Super Bowl. They had a snowstorm, and they had a Sugar Bowl, and it's really interesting that the tempo right now is as real as it gets with regards to what we are going to be talking about here.
Interesting about that is like obviously the events of January 1st with both New Orleans and Vegas, how quickly it came out of the news cycle, because the fires happened in California, and that kept us hopping over here. Obviously, you guys all know that I live well, maybe not everybody, but I live in Southern California, and so those fires directly impacted my area, not necessarily where I live, but close enough to where I have friends that lost homes and stuff in the fire. So I mean, and then we got rain right after that, which is causing problems, and then there's snowstorms in Louisiana in the south. It's causing problems there, and we're still not recovering from Hurricane Helene, and then in the midst of all this, we get a new presidential administration, which is definitely moving fast, and yeah. So are we gonna be able to keep our breath?
Well, I don't know that we have a choice, right? It's that kind of race, and being as ready as we can be in different places, that's kind of part of it, so that the folks who are sprinting as fast as they can be relieved. And one of the things that was interesting when I was in Louisiana this past week, they were talking about borrowing snowplows from another state. Who does know how to do that? Pretty interestingly. And then obviously, unfortunately, the events in DC with the plane crash. As the most recent thing, another really significant type of event and response. Just hearing some of the press conference stuff where they're talking about the things that I teach all the time. Unified command, 300 responders out there. Got to replace those responders. Got a lot going on. Got a lot of media, right? All those aspects of something that makes any kind of response a little more complex. Definitely, it's going to be a fun-filled year of topics if we stay at this pace, for sure.
Yeah, I want to talk about that plane crash here for a bit. Not about the plane crash itself, but about how, as those of us in the field, I know a whole bunch of people that are traveling at any given time. I mean, you're one of them. A couple of friends down in Texas. You have a friend of mine who, Carrie Esperanza, who's the president of IEM, she was traveling during this time. and I went through my my click box of, oh, who do I need to call to see if they're impacted by this,
Right. Right.
and even if it's something as far away as DC, now you're going, oh crap. I mean, I called you, or at least reached out to you to see if you're traveling
Right.
yet. So it's just amazing, like how small of a world we truly are when it comes to that. And then I have friends that work, and you do too, Todd, that work in the Capitol, that are part of Metro and DC Fire and Fairfax Fire. And, you see this happening. You're going, these are people who closely that are already impacted by this event, let alone the tragedy of those lives that were lost, in this tragic accident. Um, and I think that's part of the thing with what we do here, between you and myself and the organizations, that we do touch every aspect of the United States, and some part global, when it comes to emergency management. We're going to be able to bring that perspective to this conversation.
Yeah, I think the other thing that kind of jumped out at me was trying to think back through the history, and certainly some of the legacy media folks were talking about the last time we had a crash and how long ago it was. And in fact, I don't know if you picked up on it, that last one was Buffalo. And
Buffalo, yeah.
obviously Buffalo, New York, you've got connections to that place, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's my hometown. Yeah.
Right. And I'm headed to Binghamton, New York next Friday, which is not that far down the road. So it's, to bring it somewhat full circle, preparedness, response, and recovery are interconnected. All these disciplines are interconnected. How we do things, we're trying to make them as interconnected, as possible. And I think it's going to be the right conversation, especially when we bring some doctrinal things in and talking about some specific topics, and then trying to overlay it to things that are really happening. I think that's going to be one of the unique things about the conversation, hopefully, as we move the show forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing too, Todd, that you and I have some really deep conversations, when it comes to the state of emergency management, the state of disaster response, where we need to go, and how to get there. And the fact that we have, I'll kind of bookend this thing here, but we have progressive states that look at emergency management and disaster response and disaster preparedness and planning as holistic, right? So that means like fire, police, EMS, public works, right? That we always forget, public health. They're all involved in the conversation. And then you have some states and some areas that are myopic, right? And they're very much silos on everything they do. I think some of the conversation that we're going to have here is hopefully to break down those silos and be able to have those full conversations, that we are all hazards approach to everything that we look at. And I think that's critical.
Right. And I think also in the, our show concept, and I think it's important to share, in this first episode, it won't just be me and you hanging out with each other. I think our concept of bringing in guests as a third element to the show, a third voice, I think will be important. I know you're working on lining up a few. I'm working on lining up a few. It'll be exciting, as we move into the coming weeks, to get that guest lineup out to folks, and they can kind of hear a perspective. And we'll definitely, be leveraging our relationships, I think, to bring in some strong individuals to give a dynamic focus on, what we're talking about.
And speaking of relationships, I mean, the other good part about this too is, Todd, you and I both have some good relationships with some people that can bring really great insight. And so we'll be leveraging those relationships as well, to be able to bring you, the audience, some more insight to what's happening in close to real time as possible. And then, of course, my position with IEM allows some conversations to happen as well. And today, as an example, well, we have to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, is what's going on with FEMA. Well, the president has set forth his vision on making changes. And I don't think there's an emergency manager in the United States right now that doesn't think the Stafford Act needs to be, looked at and fixed, right? It's an old
Right.
act, right? And that FEMA does need
Sure.
to have, to be maybe remodeled a little bit.
Sure.
I definitely don't think it should be destroyed and taken away. But where does it belong, and how does it work? And I've been calling for a few years now. Well, let's say probably over 10 years now, that FEMA should be a standalone agency, and there's cons and pros for both for all of this, right?
Sure.
And today I got to sit down with the acting administrator Hamilton to hear a little bit about his background and what his his goals are. And the good thing is what he's doing right now is listening to the emergency managers out there, meeting with the big groups such as IEM and NEMA, big cities, meeting with them to discuss what their needs and goals and desires are when it comes to what FEMA is and can be. And I think that's a really important first step, and I commend them for that.
Yeah, the basic rules in kind of organizational leadership are you gotta figure out what your objectives are, figure out what your mission is, that type of thing, and many times it's a driving factor in where you end up or who you're working for, working under, and how it's supposed to work. I think that revisit, it's not something necessarily that every time you get a new leader in that you need to do that, but you also can't go 20 or 30 or 40 years and have problems and not do it.
Right.
And there obviously has been for some time a heartbeat out there saying, hey, let's have it as a cabinet member. And my position is, whether it's a cabinet member or not, it's still going to come down to the mission, the organization, understanding what the mission is, and the talent that's inside the organization. I was in this little teeny organization for a short time called the United States Marine Corps. It's a branch under a department, but everybody knows who we are. Everybody knows what we do because we've got a clear mission. Have had it for 250 years, and we're the best at what we do. So in some ways, when you do it well, it doesn't matter that you're not equal to the Department of the Navy and under the Department of the Navy, just as an example. And so I think that's going to be a hard, long conversation and a lot of work that'll have to be done to establish that capability that is not only understood, but is respected and is effective in the field. Because that's what's been coming into question, is its effectiveness in the field. Where it sits organizationally probably doesn't have much to do with that. So I think it'll be interesting moving forward. I'm watching from afar. Certainly have a lot of folks that I'm talking to that they're nervous, and they're trying to, decipher what's happening and figure it out, and where do I fit in. In the end, you got to do the best job that you can and not have that question, because you did the best job that could be done. And so I think that'll be something worth talking about moving forward, and watching how it kind of transpires.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I think nervousness, I think, is a good word to say. Uncertainty, right? It breeds nervousness a little bit. And I think that's kind of where we're at. And, the current administration's communication style is interesting at the best, or at the worst, I suppose, or whichever way we look at it, is sometimes I believe, President Trump just floats things out there just to see how people react. And, he's an interesting guy that way. And I think it takes a little bit of time to get used to that style of communication, whether you agree with it or not. It just is, it is what it is, right? Not putting
That's
value
right.
into it, just talking about
Wait,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was going to say, not
I was just
not
going to say
judging.
we all have to get used to how Manhattan downtown developers do business. That's what we have to get used to. and most of us haven't had to deal with that. So it's a different way that things get done. There's no question.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm not judging it. I'm not putting a value to it. I'm just saying it is what it is, and this is what we have to deal with. Um,
Right.
I, I think as emergency managers and guys that are in the field, when we're looking at situations, we have to understand that we don't have time to placate on whether we agree with something or not. We just have to deal with the consequences of what's happening, and this is where we're at. We have to deal with the consequences that are happening, and so um, that being said, what is the future of emergency management when it comes to what the federal government believes in? That's going to be a long conversation, you know.
Sure.
Um, and we we have a long history of things changing, and I think we forget this because we live in the generation that we're in, right?
Right.
And we may
Sure.
look back at the previous generations, but we live in where we're at and what we're used to, and in that comfort zone. And I think if we reflect back to when Franklin Delano Roosevelt created an office that would look at emergency management, if you will, without using the terminology, it's where we grew up from, to Truman turned it into really the civil defense of what we think of today, with the Bert the Turtle and all that nuclear stuff that they were dealing with. And then it kind of got to Jimmy Carter at this point where he turned it into FEMA in 79. And then, of course, the Stafford Act. These are chunks that we didn't live in, right?
Right.
Some
Sure.
realistically, Todd, you and I, we're from, 70s into the 80s when we were, kids. And then our working experience has been this short box. So we look at these boxes that we've lived in and not understanding what the history was and what the changes are. So this too, will be a little uncomfortable. But maybe it's
Right.
the uncomfortable that we need to be better. And if we look at it that
Sure.
way, and as long as we're part of the conversation, that's my only concern. Is if you
Sure.
start having conversation without us, then what does that mean?
Right. Right. And I think the other thing, just analyzing it a little bit as an outsider looking in, I think what are the alternatives going to be? They're talking about a few alternatives and putting pressure or responsibility in other places, like for example the states. Well, they better do a true analysis of whether that capability is actually there. It sounds great and it probably looks good on paper, but there's going to be a harsh reality that that may not be the answer. Um, and I'm not going to call out any one state or any 10 states or any 25 states. I'm just going to say there will be serious questions as to whether certain states can take on those previous FEMA responsibilities. And I think it could be a bigger mess and a bigger tragedy
Yeah.
if that's not really looked at very, very hard and and very critically in terms of what the capabilities actually are in some of those locations.
I think about the fires that we just had here in Los Angeles County, and one of the last fires that kicked off as this thing was burning. They were able to put 4,000 firefighters onto a fire in a very short period of time to stop it from burning up the town of Castaic, or the village, I guess. Right. Um, we got lucky in one aspect that there were already firefighters down here from all over the place
Right.
that we could move those assets over. You know, that's one city of California is unique in that aspect of it. I mean, I don't
Sure.
think, and I'm going to pick on a state, and I could, if you're from that state, please let me. I'm telling you, I don't know the assets, so I'm not saying that you can't do it. But if you took like Montana, for instance, who has a lot of wildland fires, I don't know if they could put in 30 minutes of a fire kicking off. Could they put 4,000 firefighters on that fire in 30 minutes of it kicking off? Or Colorado, for that matter, where you're from?
Sure.
Do they have those assets? And
Sure.
maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that's the difference between having mutual aid and the federal government coming in to be able to pay for things on the back end than it is to not, right? and again, maybe Montana and Colorado could put those assets on there. I'm not trying to say that you're not. I'm just using that as an example. I want to be clear
Sure.
on that. But you know, without federal assistance immediately, can the smaller states handle those large scale disasters as quickly as they can right now?
Sure. I definitely think that's, that resource management piece is a big aspect of it. But let's say you're a week into it. Uh, do some of the states have the ability to even manage that? When we start to think about some of the large scale operations, and maybe you have an emergency management office, full-time staff of 20 people that may not have the ability or the experience of handling that type of complexity. That is the word that always bothers me. The actual complexity. Incident command speaks to it quite a bit. We've got a pretty good system for incident command. We've got a pretty good system at the top tier of who manages complex incidents and who's qualified to manage complex incidents. Well, some of that would somewhat come into question if you don't have that guidance from FEMA, or even some of their support from an IMAP perspective. And then we're going to rely on a state agency of 16 people to be able to do it. I don't know. I think it's definitely something that it's going to be a bridge we have to cross if that's the direction that we end up going.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to some of the smaller states, and I'll pick on Maine here for a minute, because I was talking to one of the guys from Maine, and they have volunteer emergency managers.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
And I'm like, well, and it blew my mind when we had this conversation with them. I'm
Sure.
like, I never thought about that you have a town, a state that's so, sparsely populated in some areas that they just have some dude who's like, all right, I'll do it for volunteer. Like that means you get your regular day job that you're doing, and in the evening maybe
Right.
you're doing emergency management stuff.
Right.
Yeah, that kind of blows my mind a little bit. So, what do we do with states like that don't even have the ability to pay for emergency managers?
Right.
To live in what I mean, how do we and the support doesn't necessarily. I want to rewind a minute. The support doesn't necessarily have to be people on the ground, right? Those volunteer emergency managers in Maine may have the capabilities of doing it as on a volunteer basis because they don't have a lot
Sure.
of disasters that occur. That's fine. I'm not making fun of that position. What I'm saying is they need support, and the support that they might get might just be from training, grants,
Right.
to help pay for things,
Sure.
because obviously
Right.
their tax base is going to be lower. So they may need those grants from the federal government to pay for programs. The send people to EMI, or whatever they change their name to.
Right.
It's a whole other argument, for training,
To the university? Is that the
yeah,
university?
FEMA U, or
Right. Used to be FEMA U.
yeah,
.com.
good Lord.
Something.
They're gonna send us hate mail. Jeff Stearns, Dr. Stearns, we're not making fun of you, man. We're just
Right.
excuse me. But yeah, I mean, we go into this like, how do we support those smaller states that don't have big budgets? I'm lucky to be from living in California, and from New York, which are, have big budgets. But I mean, heck,
Right.
even New York State, I mean, if you want to take a look at the responders in New York State, there's the majority of the responders in New York State are volunteer.
Right.
It's one of the states that there are more volunteer fire departments in New York State than paid. So what does that look like, and what support are they getting from the federal government, whether it's through FEMA, the National Forest Service, helping out with different grants and stuff. The out here in the West Coast, we have BLM, which has firefighting assets and things that could be used. There's a lot of stuff that National Forest Service. There's a lot of stuff that we're relying upon, and maybe even too much, right? Maybe that's in the back of our mind, and we're relying on those assets, compared to saying, if let's pretend that they don't exist, right?
Right.
I don't know. That's the stuff I think is making a lot of people nervous about some of the changes that are going on right now, of the unknown answers to unknown questions.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be interesting. It's going to be good, and we'll kind of start to figure out, right, the next episode, and who knows who's going to be in what jobs. So we may get a really good guest, right, as we move forward, or some of the folks who've previously been in those positions to give us some insight. I think that's really our goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Todd, we're trying to keep these within that 30-minute window, and we're coming up to the last few minutes here,
Yeah.
On our conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the listeners out there that are coming back, and how do we, to the new listeners that might be just finding us?
I say, tune in, and we definitely will keep it interesting and keep it moving from that perspective, and give some field reporting too. That's one of the things I know that we've talked about, that we want to incorporate here, because I think it'll give a little bit different feel to the conversation. But I think this was a good one to get us started, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely, my friend. Looking forward to seeing you next week. It's always nice to see that big smile right there on
Don't
your
see it
face.
very
So
often, right?
that's
Yeah.
the important part.
All right.
All right, everybody. Until next time, stay safe and stay hydrated.